Sorry, yes, I did. Yes. It's coming up in that So when you're finished, we'll have some questions. I think.
Yes. So I'll take not more than 45 minutes.
I think that's good. Yes. So we have a good time for discussion. And I think sort of start. I mean, whenever you start, people wonder in later. So it doesn't. So I think start whenever.
It's after 5. Well, good evening and welcome to this last of 4 lectures. My voice has slightly recovered thanks to the grog served by, what do you call it, combination people? The combination service. So finally I understood what Trinity was all about. So we'll follow up on where we stopped yesterday in order to sort of sum up the description of what I call the third phase or the third age of jihadism, and give some reflections on the on what may be happening now. As will be made clear, and of course I'll be glad to take questions, and I'll try to stop in no more than 40-45 minutes to that effect. In putting up those 3 phases of jihadism, I intended to make it function like a sort of Hegelian dialectical process, i.e. phase 1 would be the phase of assertion or affirmation, where you had jihad in Afghanistan and then its copycats, which did not work. In spite of the huge success of the Afghan jihad and its consequences worldwide, the fall of the Soviet Union, and in spite of the rug being pulled under its feet by Khomeini. Then phase 2 would be the moment of negation, if I may say so, in the Hegelian process, which is Al-Qaeda, i.e. They try to understand what had gone wrong during phase 1 and to correct it. The first issue was that it was wrong for jihadists to focus solely on the nearby enemy, i.e. Local rulers or apostate despots, because the masses would not join the ranks of the jihadists or join them under the Prophet's banner, as Zawahiri had it, because they did not consider seriously those local despots. They knew that they were ultimately backed by the West, by the mighty West, and hence it was useless to mobilize. So striking the big blow at the West even though it would not destroy the West immediately, would undermine its self-confidence, its strength, and give more enthusiasm to the so-called Muslim masses. Also, among the lessons learned from phase one, Khomeini's fatwa was a big issue, and this is made very explicit in Zawahiri's book, i.e. that Khomeini won the media war without fighting one bullet with the Rushdie fatwa. He stole the show, and then it was important to build a counter show to hide what Rushdie had done, and to go one step further, which would be 9/11. Okay? So this being said, and as I know that Cambridge is a citadel of Hegelian thought, then we had a third phase, which is the Aufhebung phase, one of the few words I know in German, which is the, how do you call it in English? Dépassement, Aufhebung, what is it? Do they say Aufhebung? No? The third phase, what do you call it in English? The what? Not the combination. The combination is this thing in Cambridge where you have wine, but the sublimation, yeah, more or less. So the sublimation phase. Well, it's not the sublimation because it goes over. It's overtakes the first two. It goes over the contradictions of the first two phases, right? So, for instance, phase A, focus against nearby enemy, Mubarak, Shadli in Algeria, whoever. Phase B, phase 2, focus against the faraway enemy, America, and then go to Iraq and maybe benefit from this enthusiasm to mobilize the masses under Al-Qaeda's banner. Doesn't work either. So then maybe in the honor of the port or the brandy I had last night, or the grog, we could call it the combination phase. And neither nearby nor far away. Nearby does not work, but far away is too far away. America is too harsh to attack. And also, in the meanwhile, there started to appear an interest in European Muslims, as I mentioned yesterday. And even Al-Qaeda itself, after they launched the attack on New York and Washington, the double blessed raid, or in Arabic, al-Ghazwatayn and Mubarakatayn, which is something that echoes the raids, Razzia in French, which comes from the Arabic Ghazwa, which was, those fast attacks by Bedouins who go to an oasis or something, cut the trees, rape the women, kill the men, and take the sheep with them. And then it's over. And this was the sort of downward movements that kept the Arabian Peninsula in a state of totally derelict civilization until, so they say, the Saudis came and called one of those razzias jihad, and instead of destroying everything, they would build Islam where they had raided and intermarry and the like. So then Al-Qaeda, turned its raids or its razzias to Europe with the Madrid attack, which I think I mentioned yesterday took place exactly 911 days after 9/11, which was also a way to show to the credulous that Bin Laden was the master of time, and if he managed to do something like that, it meant that, you know, he had divine guidance, or even maybe divine help or divine sanction. Then, and it took the same form in 4 trains, just like the 4 planes. But, and also, when the attack was claimed, the statement said that Muslims, i.e. Al-Qaeda, portraying as the spokesperson for all Muslims, Muslims came to settle the records, the centuries-long record of crusaders in Spain, in Andalus, because that way they sanctioned the attack of Al-Andalus, of Spain, sorry, because they said that Spain had been a land of Islam, Al-Andalus, until the Reconquista by the Catholic kings. Hence, it had the same status as Israel to some extent, which was always also a Dar al-Islam that had been usurpated or conquered by infidels. Hence, it was licit to raid the country, kill all infidels and the like, because there had been a big controversy on 9/11, because as I mentioned earlier on, 9/11 was launched right after the Intifada of the late 1990s, 10 years after the first Intifada, had turned sour, and both Arafat and his rivals in the Islamic Jihad organization, or Hamas, used suicide attacks, which they did not call suicide attacks because suicide is forbidden in Islam, but they called them martyrdom operations, i.e. people looking for martyrdom so that they would be on the path of jihad, the path of God. And then when the same sort of way of thinking was used to justify the attacks in America, there was a big rift within Muslim and even Muslim brother ulama. Some of them, like Sheikh Qaradawi, who was extremely famous and who died in September this year at 96, who was an Egyptian-born sheikh who had become the chief telecoronist of the Muslim Brothers on Al Jazeera. Qaradawi had sanctioned the martyrdom operations in Israel, and even explained that as military service is compulsory even for women, women are soldiers, hence targets, and kids themselves, being future soldiers, are also legitimate targets. But he did not sanction 9/11 because he said America is not a former land of Islam, so it doesn't have the same status. And with this Egyptian trick, Spanish trick, Al-Qaeda tried to widen the appeal of its attacks. Well, they did not do the same in Britain when you had the attacks of July 7, 2005 in London. Also 4 vehicles, underground cars and a bus. But they sort of focused on something different, i.e. the colonial past of Britain, its arrogance, and also the big difference was that they had brought in local kids. As I mentioned yesterday, this guy with the Bradford accent who claimed it, and Zawahiri in the video that was issued afterwards would justify and explain the attack. So this would give, you know, the dimension of the third wave, the third age, the combination age. Hence, as I mentioned, it was something which I recreated ex post, where I used the divine guidance that was provided to me. Allah gave the same nom de guerre to the two ideologues. So if he had done so, this was for me to be used. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the Iraqi or the Jordanian jihadist who was active in Iraq, who had headed Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, and then who changed his strategy against the Shias before the Crusaders or the infidels in general, and who had built this sort of Islamic state. So you had a state structure which paralleled and caricatured Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime, except that it was now the Islamic State of Iraq, of Sunni Iraq. And then, simultaneously, this other Abu Musab, the Syrian, Abu Musab al-Suri, partially French educated, who criticized the pyramidal Leninist structure of the organization of jihad during phase 2, and favored a network-based, bottom-up method, and also focused his attention on the area which was in between the faraway and the nearby enemy, i.e. Europe. As opposed to America, Europe has a very significant Muslim population, immigrant Muslim population, or even converts now, which are the bulk of immigration, as opposed to America, where the bulk of immigration comes from Latin America, and Muslims are only a tiny or a small part of it. So problems of immigration, of Islam and whatever, are apart in America, where they're mixed up in some confusion in Europe. Also, he knew the place very well, and he had lived in Europe for 10 years. He knew that the voices of Salafism and apartheid, Islamic self-inflicted separation were being voiced. Some scholars, some ulama were there and started to have some access. And then you had this third phase, the ISIS phase, that combines, there again, the building of this Islamic state, anti-Shia state in Iraq, and the network-based jihad in Europe against the in-between enemy, neither nearby nor far away. And then all this was sort of clear to me as of the, say, 2008. I translated the relevant parts, of course, because the book was 2,000-something page long, of Suri's book, and and then, it did not materialize immediately. It would materialize a few years later, after Suri had been arrested and had disappeared, probably in Syria. So we had those attacks in France in 2012, where we had this young man from Algerian descent who, on the anniversary of Algerian independence, attacked French soldiers whom he thought were Muslims, but they were not. But some of them were not, the others not. They had brown skin, as apostates. And then he went and killed a number of Jewish pupils and one of their teachers in a Jewish school in Toulouse, in the south of France. And these were definitely what Abu Musab al-Suri had preconized, that in order to galvanize the Muslim masses, you have to frighten everyone who would want to go the other way, to assimilate into European society, work for their police or army forces. And I think in Britain also a number of British soldiers from Indian Muslim descent had been, I don't know, I think they weren't killed, but the guys who wanted to kill them were arrested just before, and they had explicitly wanted to kill them because they were traitors to Islam, as wearing British uniform. And then in 2015, we had the other wave of attacks against Charlie Hebdo, against the kosher supermarket in the outskirts of Paris, and then the Bataclan deadly attack, which left 130 people dead in November 2015. So those attacks were performed by people who had gone to and fro, or whose environment had gone to and fro to Syria and to Iraq and also to Yemen, and who there again targeted artists who mocked the Prophet, i.e. the Charlie Hebdo editorial staff, showing there again, as it had been shown already in November 2004 in Amsterdam, when Theo van Gogh was stabbed to death because he had insulted Islam in displaying verses of the Quran on the naked body of a woman, the verses that were chosen because they were considered the ones more hostile to women. And, and this was a way for Sunni jihadists to, in their stead, pull the carpet under the Shia's feet. They were taking into their own hands the defense of the Prophet or of religion that had been desecrated by infidels and by critical European intellectuals. Then, they, 2 days later, they turned against Jews anew, with this Ahmedi Koulibaly, who went in this kosher, hyper kosher as they call it, super hypermarket, and took the patrons hostage and killed a number of them until the police came and terminated his fate. And then in November, you had this attack against the French musical, the Bataclan. Some people said that it had been targeted because there was this sort of heavy metal rock group called Eagles of Whatever Death, which was spreading paganism. I'm dubious about it. They just took the best opportunity they had, and to attack the symbols of misbeliever and infidel youth and like. So, while this was happening in France, there was a steady movement of European youth towards the front in Syria, the military front in Syria, as we mentioned yesterday. So, as I mentioned, those areas in green after the Syrian revolt were under the control of the Sunni insurgents. Originally, it was a mix of quote-unquote secular Sunnis and different groups, but then the revolt in Syria was heavily funded by the Sunni Gulf countries originally, because they view in the toppling of the Bashar al-Assad regime a serious blow to Iran, because Iran, as we mentioned, is dependent on Syria for its outreach towards Lebanon, and from Lebanon, Iran has the capacity to strike Israel through Hezbollah, which is in the south part of, located mostly in the south part of Lebanon and also in South Beirut. So for Iran, the capacity to strike Israel is extremely important because it has its supreme deterrence if a American warplanes based in Qatar would one day take off and start bombing Iran, which they can do, then it would mean that simultaneously Hezbollah would send hell to the whole of Israel, to its northern part, but now due to the longer range of missiles to the whole of the Jewish state. So this is extremely important, and Gulf states, particularly Sunni Gulf states, were interested in toppling Bashar al-Assad for that reason, because in toppling Bashar al-Assad and in funding the revolt, then they would not have Iraq as a conduit of Iranian influence towards the Mediterranean, like, you know, the Sassanid empires of, or the Achaemenid empires of old. Then, as the revolt in Syria became more and more, let me see, I was looking, yes, as I mentioned yesterday, you see, so on the green part of Iraq here, you had the Islamic State of Iraq under the successors of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was shot by American troops in 2006, and you know that the latest emir of the Islamic State was, the last one was killed last night, so in preparation for this final Birkbeck lecture, I mean, I had called President Biden, and he said, okay, we'll do something for Cambridge. And and so they moved from these through the northern, and this is the Euphrates River here, border, El Bukamal is here, and they started to come into Syria and to here. So you see the same. This is the same picture with the two countries. So you have in the this sort of striped area here the territory that, as of 2014 and 2014-2015, was the maximum extension of what was called originally ISIS territory. Okay, and so the attacks on France in 2015 and in other countries, also in Germany, were claimed by the so-called Islamic State news agency as retribution against the West, whose armies were bombing the innocent Muslim babies in the region, right? And actually, those attacks were important because the way the Islamic State was finally destroyed in 2017, Mosul, which is somewhere here, yeah, up here, and where is Raqqa? Here, which were this was the Rio de Janeiro, and this is the Brasilia of the Islamic State, because the economy was in what could call the economy was in Mosul, and Raqqa was more the administrative, if there were any administration, except the administration of death in Syria, were bombed from the skies by Western forces, and on the ground you had in Syria, in the northern part of Syria, people coming from the Kurdish regions, here and here mostly, who were trained and equipped by Americans and who would be the ground forces that would fight against the Islamic State. This would in its stead lead to enormous problems with Turkey, because those Kurds were to some extent the Syrian branch or the cousin branch of the Turkish PKK party, of the Kurdish PKK party of Turkey, which is considered a terrorist organization not only by Turkey but also by the EU, America and the like, and maybe Britain now. And those guys there in the south led their cousins up north some of the most powerful weapons that had been given to them by Americans to destroy ISIS. So suddenly the Turkish gendarme would come against a Kurdish insurgency, and before knowing everything, they saw their armored car transform into marshmallows or minced pie. I'm trying to find some British metaphor. And before they could understand that it was because those guys used the weapons that had been given by Americans to those in Syria, right? In the Iraqi part, the destruction of on Daesh mainly relied to some extent on Kurds, but not that much, mainly on Shias from that part of the country, and then gave it more prominence. And so in France, people would say the reason for the attacks, like the Bataclan attack and then the attacks in 2016, the Bastille Day attack in Nice, where a truck driven by a Nice Tunisian went into the crowd celebrating the 14th of July and killed 80 people, plus a huge number of people who were wounded, probably half of them themselves from Tunisian origin, and also the stabbing of priest Jacques Hamel in his church in Normandy in July. Whenever it happened, they would say, we're doing that because of retribution. As if you go on killing our babies, we're going to kill you. So this was the quid pro quo. And I was to some extent personally engulfed into that, because on June 13, 2016, one of those guys who had just come out of prison at the time, they were sentenced to not too much time in prison. It has been changed, but they did a lot of mischief in between. Stabbed a policeman and his wife again in Normandy, in Magnanville, in front of the kid. And then the guy made this FaceTime video saying, now my brothers, I'm gonna be a martyr because I've killed the cop and his wife, and I want you to do the same in the sort of Abu Musab al-Suri's fashion, if you want. He did not quote Suri, he probably never even know that Suri had existed, but he sort of reused this parlance that had been disseminated through the social networks, the images and so on, and said, you have to kill all enemies of Allah, and first and foremost the journalists, and first among those journalists, Gilles Kepel, which of course was a shock, as you may imagine, because even though I have my problems with French academe, I'd rather be killed as an academician than as a journalist. I mean, adding insult to injury, let's no, the journalist present shouldn't take offense in the rain. And so I was put under police protection for 2 years, which was a strange experience. And this was the sort of dialectics of the the to and fro thing during the third phase. Okay, is that clear? So at the end of the day, ISIS was destroyed. In the meanwhile, ISIS had forbidden it to be called ISIS because it was too limitative. Their so-called caliph made a statement saying, we want to be called the Islamic State, Dawla Islamiyya, because it had a worldwide reach. ISIS meant the Islamic State in Iraq and Sham. Sham meaning Levant, right? And they wanted, as I mentioned that to you yesterday, conquer everything, including Trinity College. So they, but there was no such thing as ISIS left. The caliph was killed. I think it's in this image. No, it's another one, but we haven't got the slides on the computer here. And then, as of 2019, I think we have another image here. So you see, this is Syria in 1919. So the Kurds have, thanks to their battle against ISIS, been given a huge chunk of territory with American help, something which of course was not of the liking of the Syrian regime that had reconquered all this land thanks to Russian and Iranian help, and it was not at all of the liking of Turks, who had in the meanwhile conquered those lands here in Syria and were exerting control on this deconfliction zone where all jihadists who had fought anywhere before had been televersed, if I may say, courtesy of the Muslim Russian police, Sunni police, who took them from people from Chechnya or Muslim republics of Russia, that took them back in this area, which is a sort of hotbed of jihadists. And so, following that, you still had some places, where you have those attacks in Abu Kamal and Bahrouz, and but as of 2019, the last redux of ISIS fighters was destroyed. Then a number of them were killed. I mean, the Europeans tried to kill as many as possible, particularly their own citizens, because and used killing drones of a particular efficiency to get rid of the most dangerous guys, particularly in Bahrouz, but some escaped, and particularly the women escaped, and so they were captured by the Kurds and put in camps in Ecole and other places. And as you may have seen, there was a lot of pressure recently, particularly from Americans, so that those British, French, German, Belgian, and what have you, jihadists, mainly women with their kids, would be repatriated to Europe and sentenced there because due to the tensions in the border and the fact that the Turks may attack, then the Kurds would let the camps alone, go and fight the Turks, and then it would recreate a new ISIS in those areas. Something which, of course, is a matter of big concern, but it's also a huge matter of concern to have all those women and kids who have been socialized in the worst of conditions into ISIS worldview and mentality, and to take them into European prisons, because prisons were the incubator for jihadism in Europe. And you would, let's say that all of you here are inmates, then Jean here is Kalfa is the jihadi firebrand, and well, you've all done time because you killed an old woman to take her money and the like. So you did something wrong. So you would Jean would tell you it's not your fault. It's because of the infidels who put you in this terrible state and you had no choice, but nevertheless you did something wrong. So prison is not going to redeem you, but what is going to redeem you is to join the Islamic State and fight for Allah and kill all infidels. And once a few months before I was sentenced to death, I gave a lecture like this one in one of the big detention centers in the north of Paris, near Charles de Gaulle Airport, and from the cells you could see the planes leaving to Syria, if you wanted, and dream. And so it was something like I'm doing today, except it was slightly less complicated, and it was in French with a rudimentary vocabulary. And so there was the chief jihadist here, surrounded by his disciples, who were, peddlers and people like that, but who were fascinated by him. And so I was staying here, and in the stead of John Marenbaum was the biggest drug dealer of Seine-Saint-Denis, with one of his arms was bigger than both my thighs. On the other side, where you are the biggest bank robber. And so they were having this association because they helped to do less time, and to show to the prison administration that they were in reinsertion. So I started to give my talk, and I tried to be as fact-based as possible and as simple as possible, non-normative. But of course, the chief jihadist was not pleased, because he was the only one who was entitled to talk about Islam. And the very fact that there was someone else made him furious. So they let me finish, and as soon as I had finished, he stood up and started to attack me. And among the things he said was, "Who kills more? Is it you or us?" This was from the inside of French jail, which was interesting. We say, you say we kill you, but we don't kill you because we want to kill the women. No, we kill France. And this is going to stop when you stop killing us and bombing our babies. So, Okay, so after a while he was getting on my nerves a little. So he was a Moroccan, a guy born in France, but from Moroccan descent, and didn't have much Moroccan, and had already sent to their death a number of, he was a recruiter sending people to Syria. And I had met some other parents of the people he had sent, and like. And so as he was getting on my nerves, I answered one of his questions in Arabic, and he just didn't understand what I said. So I retranslated myself into banlieue French, and all the other convicts started to laugh at him, say, hey, you want to tell us that you know those things, Islam better than Kepel, but you don't even know Arabic. See, So he was made, fool. And then, as you know, in jail, everybody has a cell phone. It's not allowed, but everybody has one, and which also allows the prison administration to eavesdrop at times. And so he called Raqqa, this Qasim guy who was there, who was from Algeria, and France, French Algerian, and then said, well, okay, Kepel, so he whined, and then I was put on their death list. And hence, when the other guy killed the policeman, stabbed the policeman and his wife, then the first name on the list to be terminated with was me. It was not because I had said something special or written something special, but because of this shame, this hashuma I inflicted because of knowledge. So I insist on that because we're in an academic circle on the 5 brands of jihad. So then it was over. And take 3 minutes. And so the third phase of jihadism was over because it was destroyed, because it did not find its dynamism again. And So we had another wave of attacks, which took place mostly in France, but also in Austria to some extent. President Macron was very concerned, and still is, by this issue of what he called, to some extent on my suggestion, but not only, separatism, i.e. The fact that people in France explained that the country should be divided, that you should not obey the laws of the country, but you should obey Sharia, and whether it be by Salafists who try to build enclaves in some of the outskirts where, what is important is the implementation of their own law, and they have sort of minimal relations with state laws, which after a while develops into a vision of the world where the other is not a co-citizen but is an infidel who you can kill. And this, of course, is a problem when you deal with people who do not have a great intellectual level and who are convinced of that quite easily. And so we had two things in the fall of 2020. A, the trial of the Charlie Hebdo attack that had taken place 5 years prior, and B, this separatism law. And it all came in a context where, at the time, Erdogan, who has put a lot of water in his raki today, but at the time drank it pure. I mean, his Islamist raki, of course, because he doesn't drink, or so he says. But the Erdogan had re-Islamized Hagia Sophia in July 2020. I don't know whether you noticed that. It was an interesting phenomenon because this was his childhood dream. And in order to do it, he chose the anniversary of the Lausanne Peace Treaty, because he said, by the same token as Ataturk managed to revert the Sèvres Peace Treaty that had been imposed on Turkey by European colonialists or imperialists, and thanks to the use of Turkish military might, was able to negotiate a treaty which was much more favorable to Turkey, though he now is against the Lausanne Treaty because the Lausanne Treaty gave the Aegean Sea to Greece and he wants the sea for himself. Then, by the same token, we are going to display our force to re-Islamize this mosque, which was a mosque, and whatever was conquered by the sword will never be given if by the sword. And the thing was that, who had turned Hagia Sophia into a museum? Ataturk in 1935, when he wanted to, in the secularization of his country, to make it a gift to mankind. And so in order to do something against Ataturk's legacy, he put his footsteps into another Ataturk's legacy. In the name of the soldier of Lausanne, he twisted the arm of the secular of Ankara, secular guy from Ankara. So, all this being the case, so there was a lot of tension, and Erdogan was also sort of portraying himself as the leader, the new caliph, the leader of the Muslim world, taking advantage of the fact that Saudi Arabia was in difficulties from this point of view. Jamal Khashoggi had been minced into pieces in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. hence MBS was considered a pariah, and now whoever considers him a pariah has to pay his oil more, and as you know, and also because of the pandemic, there could be no pilgrimage this year. So who could show the display of strength in the name of Islam? Usually, you know, the pilgrimage is the opportunity to show 3 million Muslims gathered together. Now there was no one. Where did you see people chanting Allahu Akbar and in the sort of re-Islamization of the mosque? Istanbul, where you had the former capital mosque of the world. And in those same days, there was a trial for Charlie Hebdo. And the journalists in Charlie Hebdo, which is not the wisest thing they did probably, republished the cartoons. The issue was all that for that, all those deads, and only for a few cartoons. This immediately fanned the embers of fury in the Muslim world, and the internet was filled with attacks by what my colleague Bernard Rougier, whom I suggest is the next French Islamic Arabist recipient of the Birkbeck Lectures, because I'm going to go in retirement by the end of the year, called the entrepreneurs of rage or entrepreneurs of wrath, i.e. people who would disseminate on the websites incitations to to target you. They may be even known, they may not necessarily be like Daesh would say Gilles Kepel, but this is there were some associations, Muslim associations in Seine-Saint-Denis in the northern part of Paris that would say you have to, it is not forbidden to, it is not allowed to discuss cartoons in schools, because some teachers wanted to discuss freedom of speech with their kids, and then they said, what do you think of the cartoons? And one of them said, okay, as I'm not a racist, Muslim students, if they want, can opt out from the class, which made things even worse. And so we had this wave of attacks. The first one was a Pakistani guy who saw on his cell phone images of huge demonstrations in Pakistan. Average demonstration in Pakistan is 10 million people, but this was probably a little more, with people hanging out cutlasses, meat cleavers if you want, that look like meat cleavers, chanting, chop the head of the Charlie Hebdo journalists. Then the guy knew no French, very little English, walked his way on the internet to find the address of Charlie Hebdo. It was an old address because the new one is not public. Bought 2 meat cleavers because they looked like what he saw on the images on the internet, and tried to kill 2 ladies who were smoking their cigarettes in the vicinity, but had nothing to do with Charlie Hebdo. So there you had a degree 0 of jihadism. 0 of jihadism. I mean, this was neither top-down nor network, whatever. It went through the internet, and someone who had been socialized in this culture, in this separatism culture to some extent, then took to himself to take action. Not a lone wolf at all. It's not the lone wolf thing, which is a concept or an image derived from American extreme right actions, but it's someone who's been socialized through the web into those things. Then you had this Chechen guy who beheaded a teacher, Samuel Paty, because he had shown images of, he'd shown the cartoons in school. And then finally, someone who probably passed under my place and Professor Maronmon's place in Menton, crossing illegally the Italian border into France, and then who went to the Nice Our Lady Basilica on the day of the anniversary of the Prophet, which was on 29th of October 2020, and stabbed 3 people to death in the church. There again, the guy was a moron from some place in Tunisia. He probably was met some people in his way in Italy. We don't know exactly. I mean, it's not been clear for the time being. But there again, you know, you had this what I finally dubbed jihadism of atmosphere, i.e. there is an atmosphere of jihad which is created on the web, and some people take it to their hands, in their hands to implement whatever they read. And this, of course, is a major problem because you know, police forces and the like are used to deal with organizations, whether they be pyramidal or reticular. What can you do with that? You cannot police the whole internet. It's very complicated. Even though those movements were taken in what I had called in a previous lesson the political economy of jihadism, i.e. that, you know, terrorism has to work. If it does not work, it turns against itself. Like Al-Qaeda did not work, so they were obliged to have more and more copycat things. They made big noise, 9/11, but then what were the results in terms of mobilization? Zero. Then ISIS, to some extent, worked, but they were leveled to the grounds in Syria and Iraq, and then you know, mobilization came out, and now you have those new attacks, but they did not bear significantly any fruition, and on the contrary, they gave the opportunity to the French state to have now those laws on separatism, which allow a much bigger control of associations, of prayer rooms, of the internet, which has significantly hampered the capacity of French jihadists to this kind. And for the last 2 years, touch wood, we haven't had any significant attack except for one in Rambouillet. So, to make a long story short, and to, well, you know, we still have 3 minutes for questions, which is great. I mentioned to you earlier on what I had in mind with this sort of trying to boil all those movements down to the Hegelian dialectics of assertion, negation, and combination, were the three. Well, not really, because it's not so much of a synthesis. It's something that overcomes things. What you, yeah, you can also you can also call it with using the original Greek terms, but there's more dynamism if you in the Hegelian concept, the way I see it. And and then this was a cycle, the way I see it. It was a cohesive cycle from, say, 1989 to 2019. So, which makes what? 40 years? Yeah? 30? No, 40. 89, 99. Yes, 30. Yeah. I've always been catastrophe at maths, not only at maths, but particularly at maths. And this, in my view, this cycle now is over. And what I called, for lack of a better name, jihadism of atmosphere, as a tribute to the late Bruno Latour, with whom I participated in a book, a collective edited volume a few years ago called Les atmosphères du politique, the atmospheres of politics. This is the way I called it, but as a sort of temporary device in order to wait and see what is going to happen. Because what I've been doing all my life, and I'm writing right now a sort of brief of everything I wrote, because this is as I'm on my way out, I just sort of wanted to recap everything. And one of the problems I had was that I was making the theory of things that were happening. So the thing to do was to collect data. I mean, it's not like if you were working on Boetius, or unless a new manuscript suddenly comes to light and destroys all the theories you have. But you have a magnitude of things, of social facts that are happening. Some of them look important to you when you notice them, but then you know they will peter out and leave no no trace, no fruition. Whereas others that you may have under noticed will prove to be successful. Also, like for instance, to me one of the big challenges, I mean, Al-Qaeda was rather easy to deal with, because you had even though Zawahiri and Bin Laden came from different traditions, you know, the thinker was Zawahiri. And you know, you had this sort of Vastun, this under the Prophet banner, knight under the Prophet's banner, with his was the sort of Leninist que faire, what is to be done. And but for the third phase, which was more fluid, which is because also the spirit of times, it was network based, not organizational based. It was more complicated to understand, and I had to put that on the workshop, on the time and again, in order to sort of refine it and things. But now I'm on my way out, so this is what I've done. Those who do not agree with it can throw it away, and I just, if they want, and this will be my modest contribution, and it will be taken also into its own dialectics, which is someone is going to say, trash it all, then someone else say, okay, let's make a combination, but fortunately I will be dead in the meanwhile, so who cares anyway. So with this, thank you so much for listening to me. Sorry that my, you know, as I told John, my mother taught English, so when I was young I spoke much better English, though I dealt with less complicated topics. And I spoke with a terrible southern England accent, Hove, Port Slade, and whatever, because the young frogs were sent them to survive on a diet of jello and cardboard sausages. And but then my life took a different dimension, and I went to other places and lost sight of Brighton Rock and an accent. And so I also apologize ex post for the many mistakes and inappropriacies which I may have used during those 4 sessions. And even though it's after time, quand on aime, on ne compte pas. When one loves, it doesn't count, or one doesn't count. So I'm at your disposal to take your questions if you still have any.
So questions then.